Welcome back to That 90s Pod, everyone. If you're loving our deep dives into 90s culture, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button and tell your friends about us. Today we're going way back to the Latin explosion and more specifically, the electrifying rise of Ricky Martin.
It's more than just a catchy name, though, you know. The Latin explosion, it really did reshape the landscape of pop music. And in a way, it really did mark a moment when America started to embrace Latin culture in a whole new way.
Yeah, absolutely. And no one embodies that energy and that shift quite like Ricky Martin. But before he was selling out stadiums and topping charts, he was just this kid from Puerto Rico with a dream. His story, as we're going to discover, it really intertwines with the Latin explosion's timeline.
Definitely. It's interesting to think that that his journey actually began long before Livin La Vida Loca even hit the airwaves. You know, he started out at just 12 years old as a member of Menudo, one of the most influential Latin boy bands of all time.
Okay, so for those who might not be familiar with Menudo, can you tell us a little bit about what made them such a big deal and how that experience shaped Ricky Martin's early career?
Well, Menudo was like a pop music phenomenon in the Latin world. They were known for their catchy tunes, synchronized dance moves, and this is interesting, a rotating lineup. So when members got too old, they were replaced with younger ones. It was a unique system that kept the group fresh and appealing to a young audience for decades.
Wow, that's wild. And Ricky Martin was right there in the thick of it, honing his performance skills and building a fan base. But even with that early success, his solo career didn't take off immediately, right?
Right. After leaving Menudo, he worked on solo albums, dabbled in acting, and even appeared in some Broadway productions. He was building his artistic foundation, exploring different styles, and finding his voice as a solo artist. By the late 90s, he was ready to really make his mark on the global stage, and the world was ready for something new and exciting.
And that's where Livin La Vida Loca comes in. It wasn't just a song, it was a cultural moment. I remember hearing it everywhere. But musically speaking, what was it about that song that captured the attention of so many people?
Well, there's a few things, I think. Musically, it was a clever blend of Latin rhythms, pop sensibilities, and a rock edge. It was produced by Desmond Child, who's known for his work with Bon Jovi and Aerosmith, so it had that big stadium rock energy, but with a Latin twist, and of course the lyrics. The song tells a story, it paints this picture, and even those who didn't understand Spanish were drawn to its energy and passion.
It's true, and that crossover appeal, reaching audiences beyond just Spanish speakers, was a huge part of the Latin explosion, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Ricky Martin's success with Livin La Vida Loca, it really broke down barriers and showed the world that Latin music could be embraced by a global audience. And it paved the way for other Latin artists like Jennifer Lopez, Shakira, and Marc Anthony to achieve mainstream success. It was a collective movement, but Ricky Martin was undoubtedly at the forefront.
Speaking of moments that solidified Ricky Martin's place in music history, we can't forget his performance of La Copa de la Vida at the 1999 Grammy Awards. Man, it was electric. More than just a performance, it felt like a real cultural statement.
It really was. Imagine this. A Latin artist singing a Spanish song on the biggest stage in the American music industry, and the entire audience is on their feet, dancing and singing along. It was such a powerful moment. It highlighted the growing influence of Latin music and culture in America.
And this performance wasn't just a one-off. It was a pivotal moment in the Latin explosion. It was a testament to how far Latin music had come and a signal that it was here to stay.
And beyond music, think about the ripple effects. This increased Latinx representation led to a demand for more Latin content in film, TV, and all corners of pop culture. It's a legacy that continues to evolve today.
It really is. And speaking of legacy, Ricky Martin didn't just conquer the music charts. He used his platform to address some really important social issues. His work with the Ricky Martin Foundation is a great example of that. But before we get into that, I want to remind everyone to subscribe to That 90s Pod if you're enjoying this deep dive. And hey, if you know anyone who loves 90s music and culture as much as we do, share this episode with them.
Yeah, so you mentioned the Ricky Martin Foundation. It's amazing how he's used his fame to advocate for children's rights and combat human trafficking. Those are issues that, don't always get the spotlight they deserve.
For sure. It's a side of him that maybe a lot of people aren't as familiar with, but it's incredibly important. Could you tell us a bit more about the foundation's work and what motivated him to even start it?
Well, the Ricky Martin Foundation was founded back in 2004, and it really focuses on advocating for the well-being of children all over the world, especially those who are vulnerable to things like exploitation and trafficking. He's been pretty vocal about the horrors of human trafficking, and the foundation works on all sorts of initiatives, from research and education to community outreach and even policy advocacy.
Wow. It's so inspiring to see someone with his level of fame use their platform to bring attention to such important issues. It shows a depth that goes way beyond just being a performer.
Right. It adds a whole other dimension to his legacy. You know, it's interesting to think about how his own experiences might have kind of influenced his commitment to social justice. Growing up in the public eye and starting his career so young, he must have seen firsthand how children can be vulnerable to exploitation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It makes his work even more personal and meaningful. And speaking of personal experiences, I read somewhere that before he was selling on stadiums, Ricky actually honed his performance skills in a totally different arena, telenovelas.
That's right. He was a real heartthrob in those Latin American telenovelas before his music career really took off internationally. It just shows how versatile he is as a performer. I mean, think about it. The charisma, the dramatic timing, the ability to connect with an audience, those are all skills he probably honed during his telenovela days, and those skills then translated beautifully to his music career.
It's so funny how those paths, they seem separate, but they really intertwine to shape his whole career. You know, one thing I've always wondered about is the business side of the Latin explosion. Obviously, Ricky Martin's success opened doors for other Latin artists, but
Yeah.
did it also change the music industry in like a more structural way?
That's a great question, and the answer is yeah, it did. The Latin explosion proved to the music industry that there was a huge untapped market for Latin music all over the world. It wasn't just a niche genre anymore, it had real mainstream appeal. This led to record labels investing more in Latin artists, promoting them more heavily, and even seeking out new talent.
So it wasn't just about one artist's success, it was a shift in the way the whole industry viewed Latin music.
Exactly. It challenged the existing power structures and kind of forced them to recognize the global appeal and the commercial viability of Latin music. And this opened up a lot of doors, not just for musicians, but for Latinx writers, producers, and executives in the industry as well.
Now that's what I call a real revolution.
Hmm?
And speaking of changing the game, Ricky Martin made another really bold move in 2010 that had an impact far beyond the music industry. That's when he publicly came out as gay.
It was a huge moment, especially within the Latinx community. You know, in a culture that often places a high value on traditional masculinity, his decision to live openly and honestly was a powerful statement.
And it wasn't without its challenges, was it?
Yeah.
I'm sure there were people who didn't understand or accept his decision.
Absolutely. But he faced those challenges head on. You know, he used his platform to advocate for LGBTQ plus rights and really challenge those homophobic attitudes, especially within the Latinx community. He's been a huge supporter of marriage equality and has spoken out against discrimination and bullying.
That's a side of his story that I think deserves to be highlighted because it shows his willingness to use his fame for something much bigger than himself. He could have easily stayed silent, but he chose to speak out and make a real difference.
And by doing so, he became a role model for a lot of people, especially young Latinx people who might be struggling with their own identities. His courage kind of paved the way for others to live more openly and authentically.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even global icons can be vulnerable and that just sharing their stories can have big impact on other people. Now, before we move on to the lasting impact of Ricky Martin and the Latin explosion, I want to take a quick second to remind our listeners, if you're loving this trip down memory lane, hit that subscribe button and share that 90s pod with your friends. The more, the merrier, as they say.
Oh.
Man, it's crazy to think about how much we've covered. From Ricky Martin's early days in Menudo to global superstardom and his activism. It paints a real picture of an artist who's just constantly evolving, always pushing boundaries.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how his story kind of intersects with the whole Latin explosion. He wasn't just riding the wave, he was shaping it, influencing it.
It's true. When you look back at the 90s and the impact of the Latin explosion, you really can't ignore Ricky Martin. I'm curious, though, how do you see his legacy influencing music and culture today?
Well, for one thing, he opened the door for so many Latinx artists, and now they're the ones dominating the global music scene. We're seeing more diversity in musical styles, more representation in the media. There's just a greater appreciation for Latinx culture all over the world.
I like that it's like he planted a seed and now it's this big flourishing tree.
Exactly. And it's not just about the music either. Like his willingness to be so open about his sexuality, especially within a culture that can be pretty traditional, it really paved the way for more acceptance.
Oh, absolutely. He challenged norms and sparked these important conversations, and that's something that people are still talking about today.
His story is a reminder that representation really matters, that just being visible can be a powerful tool for change. And being true to yourself can inspire others to do the same.
That's a powerful legacy to leave behind. As we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Ricky Martin, I'm just in awe of how one artist can have such an impact on music, on culture, on society.
It really speaks to the power of music to just transcend boundaries, to bring people together, and to get those conversations going. And it reminds us that the Latin explosion wasn't just a moment in time, it was this huge cultural shift that continues to shape the world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We want to thank you for joining us on this journey back to the 90s. Hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the life and legacy of Ricky Martin. And don't forget to subscribe to That 90s Pod and tell your friends. Until next time, keep the 90s spirit alive.